Thank you so much, everyone, for taking the time out of your schedules to attend this session. My name is Jack. I'm a librarian here with the Sunnyvale Public Library. I'm very pleased to welcome you to this program to discuss all things climate migration. To present this evening, then, we have a very special guest. Mr. Julian Hattem is here with us tonight. Thank you so much, sir. Julian is, of course, the author of the new book, Shelter from the Storm: How Climate Change is Creating a New Era of Migration. He is also a writer and editor who focuses on U.S. and international politics, policy, migration, conflict, and popular culture. He is currently the editor of the Migration Information Source, the online magazine of the Migration Policy Institute. He has been on staff with the Associated Press, The Hill, and the Yomiuri Shimbun, and has been awarded journalism fellowships from the Heinrich Boll Foundation North America and the International Reporting Project to report on migration in Southern Europe and Southeast Asia. As a freelance journalist, his writing has appeared in The Guardian, The Washington Post, NPR, The Atlantic, among many other outlets. So, before I have Julian properly introduce himself, once again, we do ask that you turn off your cameras and mute yourself during the presentation. If you do have questions, please feel free to place them into the chat, and we will make sure to attend to those at the end of the talk. With that, Julian, I will let you take it from here whenever you are ready, sir.
Thank you so much. Thank you all so much for coming. Jack, this is so sweet. Thank you so much for having me. Let me share my screen if I can do that. Is this going to work? The embarrassing thing. That's working, potentially, hopefully.
Yes.
Great, perfect, amazing. My name is Julian Hattem, as Jack was very kind to just say. I've been a journalist for 15 plus years or so, based in Washington, D.C. now, traveled around a bit. I was in East Africa for a while, did some stuff in Southeast Asia and elsewhere. Now, as Jack said, I edit the magazine at this think tank, the Migration Policy Institute. But, um, climate change and migration has always been very interesting questions to me. I think that climate change is perhaps the defining issue of our time, and migration, immigration is perhaps the most politically contested. And so this book, Shelter from the Storm: How Climate Change is Creating a New Era of Migration, is an attempt to, I guess, illustrate some of the more complex social, um, geographic, political consequences of climate change. And I think too often people think, oh, climate change means it gets hot sometimes. Jack and I were just talking about. He mentioned it had been the hottest day, the hottest March day ever recently. And I think sometimes the idea of like what climate change is ends there, but no, it's not just it's hot sometimes. It's really having kind of intense ramifications of um, how we live, where we live, um, and I think that's a big deal that deserves further scrutiny. So, um, these are some estimates. Is that by in the next couple of decades, by 2050, 216 million people could be migrants because of climate change. This is a real issue. This projection right here is from the World Bank, which is and it's generally regarded as probably the most credible around. There are a range of estimates out there. Some people say as many as 1 billion people could be climate migrants, but those aren't really taken seriously. And as I'll get into, it's very difficult actually to isolate who is migrating because of climate change, in large part because climate change acts in very complex, nuanced ways that aren't always imminently visible, um, and because it kind of intersects with other factors. Um, but the point is that like the numbers are real, the numbers are very large. As you can see there from this World Bank estimate, the largest movements are likely in Africa and Asia. Partly that is because a lot of this migration is of farmers and herders and otherwise people who live off of the land, and for whom it is much more uh, visceral when the weather patterns change, when rains become less predictable, when there are prolonged droughts or hurricanes. Like those have a more meaningful impact for people who live in rural areas, and especially people in lower income countries who are generally less able or have less money to invest in infrastructural defenses and adaptations that can uh, adapt to the changing climate around them. So because climate migration is in many ways part of a broader pattern of urbanization as people move from urban rural areas to cities, which is the long-running theme. Climate migration is part of that. I should note these are estimates of movement within people's own countries, so what we call internal migration as opposed to international migration. Um, Most migration in response to or amid climate change is going to be internal within a country rather than international, but some will be international. One of the reasons for this is because there are no real legal ways to move internationally because of climate change. I'll get to that too. But that's the point being is that this is kind of a real factor that's happening in the future, but it's also already happening now. Oh, what did I do here? It's already happening now. More people every year already are displaced by disasters than by conflict. This is data from 2024, when more than people were displaced by natural disasters more than 45 million times. That's twice as much as conflict and war. And this is a high number, but the trend is kind of clear that natural disasters are a greater cause of displacement than traditional war or conflict. So yes, the trend is clear, right? Disasters, displacements due to disasters are on the rise, and in many years surpass those due to conflict and violence. And one reason for this is that disasters are simply kind of more widespread than conflict. You can see on the top, that's displacement due to disasters. On the bottom, displacement due to conflict. And, you know, as you can see, you know, conflict tends to be kind of centered in parts of Africa, parts of Central America, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, whereas disasters are really global. They are in every continent, they affect everybody, and they also affect California. This is from what, just a little over a year ago with the LA wildfires, right? The Eaton and Palisades fires. I know that you're in Northern California, but please forgive me for talking about Southern California briefly. But this is, I think, a very good case in point that like this is not just an issue that affects rural people in lower income countries. It affects some of the wealthiest neighborhoods in the wealthiest country on earth. As this article notes, this is an article from the Guardian. Not everyone who evacuates from a situation like a wildfire is able to return, but a lot of people are. A lot of people will not return, and some people will return. 7 in 10 residents of places that were displaced, who were displaced from the Eaton and Palisades fires, were not able to return a year later. Some may return, some may not, and so that there is this tension in that short-term displacement in response to a wildfire, in response to hurricanes in other parts of the country, of the world, in response to varying threats. Often people will evacuate. Sometimes they will go back to their homes. Sometimes they will not. And especially if there are more disasters that kind of pile up. If it's one wildfire, you can go back to your home. If it's two wildfires, three, four, five, eventually people may leave for good. In high income places like the US, like LA, insurance and costs are a big part of that. In this situation, outside of LA, the LA wildfires, a lot of people who were displaced and migrated away said that costs and insurance were prohibitively expensive and prevented them from being able to go back to their home. About half of the people whose homes were damaged could not guarantee that they would be able to rebuild. And so there were really lingering questions, even in places like Los Angeles, the fringes of LA. To be clear, I guess like this is somewhat of a minority. Most, as the World Bank data showed, most migration and displacement in response to climate change is going to be in lower income countries and is going to be rural. But the point is that this is a global issue that is affecting, I mean, literally everyone in some cases or another. And there is a distinction I wanted to draw here, which is between rapid onset disasters and slow onset gradual changes. Rapid onset disasters, such as wildfires, hurricanes, flash floods, will happen, as the word notes, as the data suggests, rapidly. They will happen in hours, a day or two. And so when I talk about climate migration, many people will think of this. They'll think of the Eaton and Palisades fires. They'll think of Hurricane Katrina in the U.S. for people of a certain age. And so those are good references points. Katrina, because it was, 2008, it was nearly 2 decades ago, we have a lot of data. A million and a half people were evacuated from Katrina, from New Orleans area. 40% never returned. And so while a lot of this evacuations in response to rapid onset natural disasters is short term, many people will never go, or never go back rather. Um, that said, generally speaking, lots of people do go back, and so short-term rapid onset disasters tend to result in lots of displacement, but it's often temporary and relatively short-term, whereas slow onset gradual changes such as erosion, desertification, sea level rise, groundwater salinization in some cases, these are much slower onset changes that can happen over the course of years, oftentimes decades. They are slow, they are gradual, and that is what makes it much harder to identify these changes as the cause of migration. Because if you're dealing with something like slow desertification in which you're a farmer and there used to be this much rain and now there's 5% less and then there's 5% less the following year, it's hard to kind of track precisely at what point in that chain you're making a decision to migrate because of climate change versus you're just making a decision to migrate for a variety of exogenous factors that all kind of bundle up at the same time. So when there is this slow onset gradual changes, the migration ramifications are usually much more indirect. They are much more nuanced. It often affects people's livelihoods, their way of living. Sometimes, if you live in a place where erosion is an issue, it can affect your houses. It can cause destruction, and I'll get to that in a minute. But often it's through economic impacts, which is harder to trace. But typically, people don't just deal with one or the other. There's often a combination of many different things going on. As I said, there's rapid onset natural disasters tend to happen more frequently. People can they can withstand often one disaster happening, but when disasters pile up and they come on top of slower onset drought or longer running issues, it can be a compendium of issues that really force people to abandon their home and to start thinking about migrating someplace else. And so I want to turn now to a couple of different specific examples, places that I went for the book that kind of illustrate this a bit more clearly. The first is the dry corridor, the corridor seco of Central America. It is, you can see on the screen, it's this corridor, it's a zone within Central America that is, as the name implies, rather dry. It's about 1,000 miles long from tip to tail. Basically, the length of Central America covers about half of the land area of Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua. All told, about 10 million people live here. Many of them work on very small farms in rural areas. Just a couple of acres, they grow coffee, bananas, beans, a range of both staple and sometimes crops to sell, especially with regards to coffee. And the climate change impacts are very real in a place like this. The temperature has been rising very fast, sharper than in other parts of the world. And there has also been there's actually more rain now, but it falls in kind of inconsistent and irregular patterns. So when it rains, it kind of comes in a quick burst and all dumps and then goes away and stays dry for a long time. And this also is a somewhat mountainous region, and so that results in a lot of erosion and landslides. And then there's also hurricanes. I mean, in the last couple of years, there were Hurricane Eta and Iota. Those were kind of hit back to back in 2020 that really ravaged parts of Guatemala, which is where I went. I went to a place called Chiquimula in Guatemala. It looks like this, very mountainous, very beautiful. This is along the Honduras-Guatemala border. And because it's very mountainous, the climate zones can really vary depending on altitude. So you go up high, it can be much cooler, whereas you go down low, it can be much drier. And this woman on the left, this is a woman named Consuela. That is her home. She has a little farm. She grows coffee, corn, and beans. And when things are working out great, she is great. She's been there for years, and she had been making a life there. But increasingly, the rains have become less regular, hurricanes have come through, the seasons have become less predictable, and when you live on a small farm where you grow a couple of staple crops, you need predictable, reliable rainfall and weather patterns to be able to grow. And that has made it much harder to earn a living. And also, parts of her home are like literally at risk. On the left there, you can see there's a huge gash, I guess, in the middle of the floor of one of her. The roof has come off, but that was one of her rooms, and that is part of the home where the mountain is kind of slowly eroding away. And so, as large rains come and as erosion takes place, parts of the mountain are kind of crumbling beneath her and tearing the house apart. She has been slowly trying to rebuild and replace this house or this part of her house with a new structure, which you can see on the right. That's in the works, but that is it's slightly uphill. It's farther away from the edge, but that's a long and expensive process that is hard to do. Um, for the purposes of my story, for the migration story, the point is actually about the Consuela's son, her 17-year-old son. I met her a couple years ago. He had left home about a year before that, and he had gone to New York City, actually. He is undocumented. He does not have legal status, but he is able to work a little bit. I actually don't know what kind of jobs he was doing, but he was able to send back about $300 a month. Of that, about two-thirds goes to pay down the debt from the coyote, the purple, the human smuggler who helped arrange the trip, which cost about $6,000 for him to migrate from Guatemala to the U.S. So only about a third of that $300 or $100 a month actually goes to Consuela and helps her rebuild and reinvest in her home. But that money is helping to pay for things like this new building and to be able to help her uh, think about staying in place and rebuilding her new home. But it was very clear when talking to her that for her son, the future in this place in Chiquimula seemed very dim. There did not seem to be like much of a life there. There did not seem to be like that was a place where his prospects were looking good. A lot of other people in Chiquimula moved to the capital, Guatemala City, which is the most populous city in Central America. It's also projected to be a major target of climate migration in coming years, especially from other parts of Guatemala as the country deals with a combination of industrialization and climate change that is drying up urban farms, or rural farms rather, and subjecting them to less regular weather patterns that's harder to predict and makes it harder to become a farmer. And, generally speaking, although Consuela's son went to the US, as I said before, most of this migration stays within the same country because it's cheaper, it's logistically easier, it's legally easier. People speak the same language. In the US, Consuela's son did not have legal status. I do not know what his current position is, if he has been deported or he's still in the US or what. And although the money he could earn in the US was probably, especially for a 17-year-old, was a lot more than he could probably have made in Guatemala, there were also very serious risks there too. But uniquely in Guatemala and in some other parts of Central America, the Consuela's son story plays into a larger role and a larger narrative about migration, in that there is a long running history of migration from Guatemala to the US and to Mexico, but also to the US, that existed before climate change. A lot of this stretches back to the 1980s when climate change was not really on people's radar. And as climate change has compounded, it has exacerbated the factors for some of that movement. Um, there was an internal conflict, a civil war that happened in Guatemala for 36 years, from 1960 to 1996, which involved a genocide by the government against the Mayan people. Consuela is Mayan. And if you kind of add all of those ingredients up, you get a situation in which there are like many rising pressures for people to leave their homes. And if you just like add climate change on top, it can sometimes be kind of the straw that broke the camel's back, or the proverbial the tipping point that it's just the one extra thing that makes that tips the calculation to make migration seem slightly more interesting or more profitable than staying in place. I want to turn now to a second location where we see a slightly similar and also a slightly different version of the same story. This is in the Bangladesh in southern Asia, in particular in a place in the southwestern Bangladesh, the Sundarbans, which is there in the bottom left of the map. This is a map of Bangladesh, and the dark red is climate vulnerability. The darker the red, the more vulnerable the region is. The Sundarbans is the world's largest mangrove forest, and it's really kind of the funnel for a lot of water that comes down from the Himalayas in some senses. Multiple rivers drain into this mangrove forest and then on into the Bay of Bengal. And it routinely, because of its location, just routinely gets hit by cyclones, huge winds, and flooding that make it a very difficult, increasingly difficult place to live in the era of climate change. Bangladesh is generally regarded as one of the most climate vulnerable countries on the planet. And part of that is because it's a very dense country, and also just because of, for a combination of geographic and other factors, it gets walloped by these storms very regularly. Also, parts of the country are very tidal. The rivers are very tidal. So, salt water can kind of come back and forth in from the bay. And as sea level rise increases, so as the seas get higher, it pushes the salt water higher and higher back up the bay, which can seep and leach into the groundwater and into people's farms, particularly rice paddies in this area, which kills the rice and makes it harder again to become a farmer. Then at the same time, because it's a delta area, people live on riverbanks. And so as hurricanes come in, it has intense rains, intense storms, and it causes intense erosion that carves away at riverbanks and wipes people's houses out. It's not as mountainous as Guatemala, but similarly, erosion causes a lot of challenges and washes areas into the sea, or into the rivers in this case, sorry. This is one community I visited that had been wiped out by a previous cyclone. Basically, now it's flooded as the floods rise and ease with the tides. As you can see, people build these bridges to get by. In some ways, reminded me of like Venice or something in a kind of weird parallel universe. I think it's water is just very much everywhere, and it's just a constant battle about dealing with the water. Lots of people I talked to talked about particular cyclones that hit, which would flood their entire community for months at a time, and they have struggled to get by. A lot of people in Bangladesh moved to the capital, to Dhaka. It is one of the most populated and one of the most densest cities in the world. There's something like 25 million people. And a stat that goes around is that 2,000 people move from Bangladesh's countryside to Dhaka every day. And many of them are fleeing climate threats like those in the Sundarbans. There's fleeing cyclones and the rising salt water and the kind of increasing improfitability of being a farmer and living in rural areas. Because Bangladesh does not have the history of international migration to a place like US that Guatemala has, much more of the migration here is internal, and it's to Bangladesh. And when they get to Bangladesh, migrants often live in difficult situations. The pictures here are from a major slum called Korail, which the living in Korail is not always a great existence. I met a lot of people in the slum, in the informal community, as we call it, who had moved from the countryside in response to cyclones and other climate disasters. And I think repeatedly they said that there was climate challenges that made that forced them to move in the immediate term, but also climate challenges that prevented them from the prospect of a future in kind of the longer term, that there was no jobs in the countryside, there was no money there, there was no education there. And I bet some people who had lived in the slums for a decade plus um, and said that, this was it, it was the future. Obviously, why would they move anyplace else? They needed a job, they needed a prospect of healthcare. The slums are a very difficult place to live, but there are things nearby. There are some services, there are NGOs, things like that. Um, and being able to tap into that is was invaluable, even if the challenges of living in Islam are very real. Um, Again, much like in Bangladesh, though, this movement taps into and is a part of a broader trend, urbanization in this case. There's also kind of high population, industrialization. Lots of people in the slums and elsewhere in Bangladesh were working in garment factories. A lot of like factories are taking root to kind of help people uh, that have become jobs for a lot of people. Um, I want to talk to the people. I want to talk as much as I want to talk about people who do move. I also want to talk about the people who can't move and who are left behind, because in a lot of these places, you know, migrants face very real challenges after they get to Dhaka, after they arrive in a place like the U.S. But when disaster strikes or when conditions turn bad, it's actually very good to be able to migrate and to get out, whether that's temporary in the case of a cyclone or a wildfire, or it's on a permanent basis if you think that you're a farmer in a location that's not very conducive to farming anymore. Being able to leave is a benefit, is a good thing. And in many ways, the people left behind tend to be kind of stuck in place where they're either exposed to repeated deadly disasters or unable to do anything as their kind of incomes winnow away and their livelihoods become increasingly less profitable. Sometimes academics refer to these as so-called trapped populations because they end up in these spirals in which working makes you earn less money by working, then you have less money to be able to support yourself, and as more crises come, it reduces your ability to earn, and the cycle can persists and continues. On the left is a woman in Guatemala named Elena. She lives actually 15, 20 minutes away from Consuela, the first woman I showed. Her husband, Elena's husband, is a for-hire farmer, so he works on farms, but for other farmers. He does not own his own farm. They had a 5-year-old daughter who had an undiagnosed health issue that they couldn't see a doctor for. They couldn't afford to see a doctor for. They had an elder daughter who was 17, I think, but she had dropped out of school during COVID because they could not afford school fees, so she was unable to finish her schooling. No one in her family had migrated. It just would have been too expensive and was not feasible. On the right is a couple I met in Bangladesh. It's Abdul and Shana is his wife. They collect tiny, like inch or 2 inch shrimp from the river that you can see behind them. They earn about $1 or two a day doing that. Um, and you can see their house is very like rough hewn. Their previous house had become a victim of erosion during a previous cyclone. It was on the riverbank, and parts of the earth underneath gave way, and the house fell into the river. And so they erected this house relatively recently. It's not very sturdy, but it was what they had. They actually did have two sons who migrated away, who left where they were living in a place called Pratapnagar in Bangladesh. But the couple did not want to move. They didn't want to follow because they said they didn't know anyone anyplace else. They didn't know how they would work, and they just had no community. They had no society. They Everything they knew was where they were, and the idea of moving was just very intimidating and unpleasant. So even though the prospects for the sons was better, for the older people, there was it was intimidating and terrifying to have to move. Which gets to the point that a lot of people who don't move tend to be older, which, aside from having dangers of not being able to move, makes it harder for them to recover in the face of climate adversity. I note that something like half of the people who died during Hurricane Katrina were over 75 years old, and so a lot of them could not get out, um, which is a real issue. A lot of people who do not migrate also tend to be poorer because, as I said, migration can be expensive. I talk to people in Guatemala for whom they could pay $20,000 to have to move to the US, which is a huge sum of money. And that's, entirely unfeasible for a lot of people. It's also geographically far and logistically complicated to move either to a big city and certainly internationally. We talk about social capital when people want to migrate. It's not just having money, but also knowing where to go and like what bus to take and how, even when you get to some destination, how to find a job there. Where, a place where you can, like a cousin's house where you can crash for a couple of weeks while you get on your feet. One of the reasons that immigrant communities tend to kind of form in clusters is because somebody knows someone who's got a cousin, who's got a brother, who's friend from church can help them and they know a connection. And these kind of social connections are incredibly valuable. And if you don't have those, it just becomes very difficult to migrate and very difficult to take advantage of the benefits of migrating. So, like, finally, there are personal reasons why people don't want to leave their home. Abdul and Shana did not want to leave the place where they have lived their entire lives, and that's a very real um, sentiment that I'm very aware of and very cognizant of. In many cases, this is places where people's entire generations have lived, where their ancestors are buried. They've got deep personal, spiritual connections to the land and where they are, and that's very real, and that prevents a lot of people from leaving their homes, whether it's in rural Bangladesh, it's in New Orleans after Katrina, it's in LA where wildfires occur. People don't want to leave. Their things, their memories, their photo albums. It's a big one people talk about, and that it's hard to let go of that. And so there is this kind of paradox where some of this discussion is largely about migration and people who do move, but there is also a paradox that in a lot of ways, climate change is often preventing people from moving. Because for many reasons, historically, generally speaking, migration is good for people, or at least it can be good for people. And part of my point is that uh, historically, migration has been one of the greatest uplifters out of poverty that the world has ever known. Um, Obviously, if there is a natural disaster coming, a cyclone, a wildfire, the causes and the reasons to get out and to leave are kind of obvious. It's good to be safe. But in a broader sense, migration can also be a way of adapting to a different kind of life. This graph is a graph from the World Bank, again, of remittances, which is the amount of money that migrants send back to their home countries through things like Western Union or PayPal or whatever. As you may be able to see, it got up to $900 billion in 2024. That's more than, official global foreign aid combined. The amount of money that people are sending home as remittances to their loved ones, to their families, to their churches or community groups is really large and staggering. And in some cases, it is a significant portion of the economy. About a fifth of the GDP of Guatemala comes from remittances. Even a quarter or so of the GDP of the economies of El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Honduras come from remittances, just because there is a long history of people migrating and sending back money and helping invest in their community. And in the context of climate change, this money is even more important. It can help people defend against the worst impacts of climate change and can help people kind of counterintuitively stay in place. I talked about Consuela, the woman in Guatemala at first, whose son had migrated to New York, was sending back $300 a month, some of which was going to help her rebuild her house. That money was helping her stay in place. I mean, if there was less money coming to her, it might be harder for her to be able to continue to live there, even with all of the challenges she's facing. In other contexts, you see that a lot of people spend money, remittance money, on things like air conditioning in certain hot areas, sea walls if you're up against the ocean, various other natural defenses as might be required. But also Migrating isn't just about money, though, too. It's also can benefit people in much less tangible ways and non-financial ways. They often will learn new skills, they'll meet new people, they'll make those social ties, those social connections. So whether or not they stay as migrants or not, um, they will have those ties that can help them either in their country of origin or in their country of destination. But migration can also be a benefit for the places migrants go to as well. This is a factory area in a city called Mongla in southwestern Bangladesh that has grown a lot in large part because of incoming migration from the surrounding region. This area, the city of Mongla, has the second largest port in Bangladesh, and it's a major production place for clothing, for the kinds of shirts and pants that you get at Target or the Gap or whatever. The population of the city has basically tripled since 2010, and the city has really intentionally tried to benefit from that migration and use that as a ready supply of labor that it can pivot into economic growth. And there are certainly challenges along the way, but like when the city leadership starts with that perspective in mind, it can be very beneficial in a lot of ways. Um, I'm seeing there's some comments in the chat. Sorry, and I apologize if I have not been looking at these earlier. Uh, some conflicts do have. There's a question about conflicts having roots in climate change. Yes, that's true. I might hold that to the end if that's okay. Um, no, the personal remittance data from the World Bank is not related to migrants displaced by climate change. That's just general remittances based on all migration, and not even just migrants themselves, but also, sometimes the children of migrants or their grandchildren or whatever who will send money back to, their great grandma in whatever origin country. Um, but that is to that point, migration is a lot like other kinds of migration in this way. Uh, and because it is hard to identify who is a climate migrant and who is another person who moves, a lot of the trends of what we're seeing in regards to climate change, climate migration are just like regular migration, the long running history of migration. I talked about Guatemala and the long running, the culture of migration, we call it, that like it has encouraged people since the 1980s to move to the US. Those same factors of, economic factors and social connections, et cetera, those are also at place in climate change, in the era of climate change. Human beings are an intensely migratory species. I'm not going to speak for anyone in the room. I live in Washington, D.C. now. I was not born in Washington, D.C. My great-grandparents were not born in Washington, D.C. I migrated here. I am from a series of migrants that has worked out pretty well for me. But there has been migration, throughout the course of human history. And generally speaking, it has in many cases worked out. And so what we're seeing now is an exacerbated and a more extreme version of a type of migration that in some cases has always been present. And wildfires are not brand new. There have always been wildfires, right? There have always been hurricanes. There have always been droughts and various other natural disasters. To be clear, what's happening now is more extreme, more regular, and this regular weather patterns are less predictable. But the underlying environmental pressures and the underlying environmental pressures on people to move have always been a factor in human movement. These are pictures from the Dust Bowl, Dorothy Lang. You're in California, you know the story. This is Nipomo, California, which is the Central Coast, right by San Luis Obispo. For people who did not read John Steinbeck in high school, the short version of the Dust Bowl was that there was a major drought that swept across the southern Great Plains area, basically kind of northern Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas area, right in the middle of the Great Depression. A lot of farmers could not grow crops. They moved to California. and this was like the 1930s. All told, more than 1 in 10 residents of California in 1910 had moved there from Oklahoma, Texas, Arkansas, or Missouri. And part of the reason for the population explosion in California over the mid to late 20th century was because of this migration. But just like with these other cases, just like with Guatemala, just like with Bangladesh, the climate factors, the drought was just the straw that broke the camel's back. You know, it came on top of the depression, which was already ongoing, the rise of mechanization and mechanized tractors, which made a lot of like manual labor redundant and made it easy for landowners to fire or to say to not employ farm hands anymore. It also followed a period of very high commodity prices amid World War I, which pushed a lot of people who didn't really know how to farm into the farming business. And you know, there were also the motor vehicles, which made the prospect of getting from Texas to California feasible in a way that like 20 or 30 years earlier would have been impossible. And so it was, I mean, I guess to use a bad phrasing, it was a perfect storm of factors that all came together and created this wave of migration. And the headline that people take away is drought came, people moved, but really it's drought came and on top of 10 other things that happened, people moved. Um, and so some of what's happening here is new, but a lot of it is part and parcel and an exaggerated version of long-running trends. Um, and importantly, people themselves rarely think of themselves as climate migrants. There was a guy I talked to in Bangladesh named Monjurul, and I had a moment with him where I had some translators, and we had been talking about this guy as a climate refugee. That's just the shorthand we had been used. And I asked him if he thought of himself as a climate refugee. And because he had been living in a house that had suffered from erosion, fallen into the riverbanks, fallen into the river. He had to move. Then the other place he was living also suffered from a cyclone. He had to move for a second or third time, and he struggled a bit. And each one was clearly kind of a natural disaster or climate related factor why he moved. I asked him if he thought of himself as a climate refugee, but it did not translate. Like no part of him thought that he was moving because of climate change. He was just a guy who had some sons and wanted to earn some money and help his sons kind of get some land and get up in the world. Like the notion of being a climate migrant was not really part of his vocabulary, as it probably also isn't for the people who fled Hurricane Katrina or who were evacuated a year ago from Los Angeles from wildfires and have never been able to go back. But all that said, and I'm running kind of short on time here, so I'll speed up. One place where things are very clearly different and where what is happening is kind of existential is in the Pacific. And I'm particularly referring to a series of small, low-lying islands, atolls, that are facing sea level rise and where there is quite literally no place to go. This is a picture of Kiribati. It's one of the islands of Kiribati, which is a country of 33 islands. There are about 100,000 people that live there total. The average land height is only 6 feet above water. Sea levels have risen about 3 or 4 inches in the last couple of decades. Sea level rise is continuing, and because of tidal surges and things like that, there are predictions that Kiribati and some of the other similar island nations could be completely unlivable in the next 2 decades. Already lots of residents have moved to the capital called Tarawa, which has created a lot of overpopulation. It's too dense. There's an over reliance on services. And this is something brand new. This is not This is not an evolution of the Dust Bowl. This is not what's happening in Guatemala. This is kind of a brand new issue that's that's a unique challenge. But there are basically no legal ways for people to leave places like Kiribati or any other country solely on the grounds of climate change. I mentioned that in Bangladesh, I had referred to this guy, Manjurul, as a climate refugee. Legally speaking, no one is a climate refugee. International refugee law is pretty strict. It limits protection to people with a well-founded fear of being persecuted because of their race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group or political opinion. climate change isn't in there. No countries basically have protections for people displaced by climate change. And a part of that is because it's very difficult to prove that someone is displaced by climate change. If you're a if you're a farmer in Guatemala and your coffee is not growing, maybe you're just a bad farmer. Maybe it's climate change. It's hard to kind of prove what the actual issue is there, and it's a very tricky issue. And also, there is a general antipathy or hesitancy towards immigration generally. We are not in a global environment where leaders are leaping out of the woodwork to offer new legal pathways to forcibly displace people. Um, and that's basically the end of my talk. I wanted to get back to the question that someone asked about conflict caused by climate change. And the short answer is yes, there are instances. There are very clearly instances of conflict caused by climate change and migration. A lot of this is of um, when the scarcity of resources and when people are pushed into the same area and have to use the same resources that are winnowing. We see, for instance, in West Africa, with nomadic herders and farmers often tend to compete over land or water, actually, more accurately. And that can push them into conflict. Um, and it exacerbates kind of underlying fault lines. Um, and there's been some description of Darfur in Western Sudan as being the world's first like climate change conflict, in part because there was real climate impacts that were ongoing at the same time as there were kind of other racial ethnic tensions. The point is that yes, absolutely, climate change can be a precipitant for conflict, but it's basically not the only thing that's happening. Usually there's, much like with migration, there's other animosities and sentiments. And then this one extra thing happens, right? Then there's this competition over the lake and who gets to use the lake. And that can be like the final tipping point to push, an angry confrontation into a violent confrontation. Um, so yeah, thank you very much for listening to me. I apologize about the early tech troubles. Really appreciate that. Um, but I've got next 10 minutes. I'm happy to answer any questions. You can also send me an email, jmhattem@gmail. I'd love to chat in any forum that would allow it.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Julian, for the talk. That was quite illuminating, and I believe we all learned a lot this evening. I really appreciate your time and expertise. If you do have more questions, feel free to place them in the chat. I have several questions written down for you to maybe get the
Yeah.
ball rolling if people, are typing out. And it kind of ties into what you just answered from, I believe Mukund put that in the chat. I think in the book you kind of discuss this about this idea that, you know, um, for these people or for these migrants, like the deck is often, stacked against them. It's almost rigged, right? Um, how much of this crisis then is a natural disaster, and how much of it is, a failure of our economic systems, our political systems, our social institutions? It's a very broad question, but
No,
yeah.
it's a very important question. You use the word natural disaster, which I think is a crucial one here. So there are there are advocates in the space that won't use the phrase natural disaster because the idea is that there's no such thing as a natural disaster. Like if, I live in Washington, D.C. in a nice brick home. If my city gets hit by a hurricane, it's fine, right? I'll save some water. It's fine. I can get through a couple of days. But if you're in rural Guatemala, rural Bangladesh, and a cyclone comes, the challenges are much more extreme. So it's not the disaster, it's not the weather that's the disaster. It is the economic and political systems that have allowed for kind of vulnerabilities to magnify, to create the situation. And I should make explicit too that like it is the case that many of the people most impacted by climate change are the ones least responsible for carbon emissions and for creating climate change. Kiribati, the small Pacific island, the carbon emissions from Kiribati are basically negligible, and yet their home is going to be subsumed much faster than those of us for who are largely responsible, the countries and corporations who are largely responsible for climate change. Yeah. Um, Henrik has a question in the chat, if I can go to that, about are there models to predict future migration due to climate change? Uh, yes. I mean, so there are models. The tricky thing is that it's all dependent, and it is all to one degree or another not reversible, but like it can be affected, right? So many cities, so I know more about, I don't know less about California. I apologize. Many cities I know on the East Coast that are contending with sea level rise and increased storms are investing a lot of money in defenses to prevent that from happening. To prevent, after Hurricane Sandy hits the New York area, New York City invested billions of dollars in this defense mechanism to prevent the city from being inundated. My favorite example of this is actually Venice, which has I don't have the number on me, but invested huge amounts of money in a system called MOSE, MOSE. It's like Moses. It translates. It's like an acronym in Italian. But the idea is that like certain cities and communities and countries will invest huge amounts of money to keep the bad weather out, and you can kind of do that. So how are there models? Yes, there are models, but it all depends on how much people invest in adapting to climate change. And on an international level, this is kind of bureaucratic, but there are several UN mechanisms, the Adaptation Fund. Um, there's an effort, there's this move towards what's called loss and damages, which is basically giving money to the people and communities and countries that have been most impacted by climate change in order to help them recover from their losses. But the idea is if you invest in enough money to build seawalls and build defenses and build other bridges, or build other protections rather, you can reduce a lot of displacement and migration. And so, everything going forward is just a guess as to whether or not some of those investments will be made um, versus not. Mm. There's a question about whether tracking regional cooperative efforts to combat the local effects and alleviate the impacts on local populations. Yes, I mean there are lots of regional local efforts to help people adapt. I mean, as I tried to get to, people want to stay in place. People want more money, but they want to stay in place, especially if it's your culture, it's your heritage. The people love their home and they feel deeply connected to their land, and sometimes in a very spiritual sense. And so there are many efforts to try and there's dredging efforts, for instance, in the Pacific to try and kind of build sand protections, various dikes and things like that. When I was in Bangladesh, there were actually, I didn't include it there, but there were efforts by the government to build concrete seawalls across a lot of the delta to help protect people and to prevent the areas from washing out to the river. It's expensive. I mean, the short answer is that it's expensive and it's hard to track how much that all costs. But like I mean, people are it is becoming an increasingly important, I think, lifeline for a lot of communities and a lot of countries. Yeah. Oh, insurance. You brought up the insurance question. Yes, insurance is a big. For those not reading the chat, Henrik brought up a question about insurance companies must be all over this. Um, my email. Dropping my email in the chat. Yes, insurance companies are all over this. I'm not a numbers guy, and I apologize about numbers, but this is a big deal. So I was saying to Jack earlier, I grew up in Arizona. A lot of people in Arizona are unable to get insurance because of wildfire risk. I think it's a big issue in California. Generally, nationwide wildfire risk, as wildfire risk increases, insurance premiums are increasing. A lot of people, like insurers, have simply pulled out of the market. I was talking with someone anecdotally the other day who moved from Florida to Texas in large part because they were going to pay like a third as much in insurance. And so I think, especially within the US, because, if I get hit by a hurricane, like I said, my house is fine. No, sorry. I get hit by a hurricane, my house is fine. But like, if I'm a homeowner, my premiums go up year after year after year. And like, that is a real issue that will push people to migrate in a lot of ways. So yes, insurance companies are all over this. Um, Flood insurance is kind of different because in the US we have this thing called the National Flood Insurance Program, which is kind of a federal guarantor of flood insurance that is people find very problematic because the argument is that it can effectively incentivize building in flood vulnerable areas. It's a tricky story, but an interesting story, but very in the weeds about insurance stuff. But the short answer is yes. Insurance companies are all over this. If you are an insurer, if you know anything about insurance, it's a big problem. It's a big deal.
Thank you, Julian, for monitoring the chat for all
Sorry,
these
no.
questions. No, I appreciate the excitement. A couple more questions because I don't want to keep you too
Oh,
long.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um, I know that, and you mentioned this earlier in the presentation too. One of the core kind of sentiments or arguments in the book is that, humans have always been, a migratory species. Um, why is it important for readers then, to understand migration as a historical constant rather than just a modern contemporary crisis, if that makes sense?
Yeah, yeah. That's a good question. Um, I think for a couple of ways. I think that I my my perspective is that I think it helps us understand current, especially climate migration, but also general or other kinds of migration as like part and parcel of a broader story. And that context and that perspective helps, I think, helps humanize people who are themselves migrating. If you can see your great grandparents in someone else's story, if you can see their story in someone else's story, I think that holds some resonance. But also, I think seeing the migration of people in Guatemala or Bangladesh as moving in response kind of to the same forces that are move, making people in New Orleans or Palisades outside of LA also move. It's the same kind of global forces. I think that climate change is a global issue. It affects us in uneven ways, but I think it affects everyone to some degree. And migration is a deeply human and global and historical trend. And I think I started off by saying that I think climate change is the most important issue of the era, and migration is the most politically contested issue of the era. And I think if we are able to kind of have some bridges of understanding, I guess, in those on these topics that are often given to heightened emotions. I think that helps to take the temperature down and helps to see it as a human dynamic rather than like a political dynamic, I guess.
Absolutely. Last
Yes.
question, then I will get you out
Yep.
of here. For those attending tonight, for readers of the book, who may feel overwhelmed by kind of the harrowing nature of climate change and the kind of the monolith that it seems to be, what are some of the takeaways that they should have, regarding their own position in this kind of global shift that we see occurring?
Yeah. No, I mean that's a good question. I think seeing yourselves as part of the broader story, and seeing our own story, seeing I think I say at some point in the book that the same trends that compelled the Dust Bowl migrants are the same ones that like compelled the Guatemalan migrants, and there's kind of a through line there. I think seeing it as part of a bigger story, I personally find helpful. I think um, I think there is often a tendency to view what is happening as like the most extreme, most radical thing that's ever happened, and everything is a crisis, and it's so terrifying. And climate change is a crisis. Like there's very real issues going on, but like it's not ahistorical. It's not it's idiosyncratic, but like it comes from something. And I generally believe that like if you understand where things come from, you can like kind of understand where they're going and why. And I think if you understand that like this migration in response to climate change is of a piece with broader migration, um, then it makes a bit more sense. It's less terrifying, I guess, in that way.
Makes sense. Well,
Yeah.
Julian. Thank you so much for your time this evening and your expertise. We really appreciate you being here. The book is Shelter from the Storm: How Climate Change is Creating a New Era of Migration. It is coming to the library very soon. It is on its way. It's on order. So put a hold on it now before someone else is it first. Thank you guys too for joining this session. We really appreciate you guys being here. With that, we'll let you all go. Julian, again, cannot thank you enough. Really appreciate your time and have a lovely evening, all of you, and we'll see you soon. Thanks again.
Thank you all so much. Have a lovely evening. Cheers, y'all.